Elliot was used to the quiet of space. As a lone pilot, he often floated through the stars, navigating from one far-off planet to the next. His ship, the Venture, was more than just a vessel. It was his home, his companion, and his escape from the noise of the world. But that day, something was different. He had just finished a routine scan of a nearby derelict trade station when his sensors picked up something unusual. At first, he thought it was just another piece of debris floating aimlessly in the void. But as he zoomed in on the station, he saw her, a figure, small and hunched over, standing near the entrance of the station's airlock. She was dressed in torn clothes, and her skin appeared pale, almost as if she had been in space far too long. Her eyes were wide, and she seemed to be scanning the area around her in a mixture of fear and curiosity. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He had seen many things in his time as a spacefarer, but nothing like this. A living being, completely alone, on a station that had been abandoned for years. Without thinking, he powered down the ship systems and brought the Venture into a smooth docking maneuver. He hadn't expected the figure to notice him, but she did. Her gaze turned to him as he stepped out of the airlock. The moment their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, though neither of them knew what it meant. The girl looked as if she was about to speak but stopped, unsure of whether she could trust him. Elliot took a slow step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but one thing was clear. She was hungry, desperate, and he couldn't ignore that. He opened the small compartment on his belt and pulled out one of the food packs he always carried. Basic, nutrient-dense meals designed for long journeys. He stepped closer, holding it out to her. "You look like you could use something to eat," he said gently, trying to sound reassuring. The girl eyed the food pack with a mix of disbelief and hunger. Slowly, she took a cautious step forward, her delicate fingers brushing against the packaging. She hesitated, glancing up at him as if unsure whether this was some kind of trick. "It's safe," Elliot said softly. "You can trust me." After a long moment, she finally accepted the pack. She tore it open and quickly took a bite, almost as if she hadn't eaten in days. Her eyes closed in relief as the food filled her stomach, and for the first time since he had seen her, she seemed at ease. Elliot watched quietly, wondering who this girl was. She wasn't human. That much was clear from her unusual features. Her skin had a faint iridescent sheen, and her eyes were larger than human eyes, with a vibrant color that he couldn't quite place. Her ears were pointed, and her movements were swift, almost feline in nature. When she finished the food, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but filled with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her words slow and careful. "I didn't think anyone would find me here." Elliot smiled, though he didn't understand how she had ended up in this lonely corner of space. "I'm Elliot. What's your name?" She paused, then glanced down at the floor as if searching for the right words. "Carrie," she said softly. Her voice carried a sadness, as if her name was tied to something lost. "I was left behind. I was part of a trading group, but they abandoned me." Her eyes flickered with pain as she spoke. Elliot's heart went out to her. He had seen many lonely people in his travels, but this was different. There was something in her gaze that told him she had been through far more than any one person should endure. "Don't worry," Elliot said, his voice firm yet kind. "You're not alone anymore. I'll help you get back to where you belong." Carrie seemed to study him for a moment, her gaze intense and filled with uncertainty. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you," she whispered again. Elliot knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something that neither of them could have predicted. He wasn't sure what had brought him here or why he had been the one to find her, but one thing was certain. Carrie needed help, and he would do whatever it took to give it to her. As he led her back toward the Venture, he felt a strange sense of purpose fill him. He didn't know where this journey would take them, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave Carrie to face the cold emptiness of space alone. Not ever again. The days that followed were full of small moments of discovery. Elliot and Carrie spent their time aboard the Venture, getting used to each other's presence. While Elliot was no stranger to space travel and isolation, it was clear to him that Carrie was still adjusting to life aboard the ship. Everything was new to her. The sounds of the engines, the flashing lights of the control panel, even the way food tasted. Every small detail seemed to catch her attention, and Elliot watched with a mixture of curiosity and amusement as she explored the ship. At first, their communication was limited. Carrie spoke a language that was alien to him, and although he had studied many languages during his travels, this one was unlike anything he had encountered. She would speak in soft, melodic tones, her words flowing like a song, but Elliot could not understand a single one. He would offer her food or show her how things worked on the ship, and she would smile politely, but there was always a distance in her eyes. Elliot knew he had to find a way to connect with her. He couldn't leave her stranded in silence. One evening after dinner, Elliot decided to try something different. He pulled out a small tablet from his pack. It was a language translator, one of the many tools he carried for his work. He'd used it in the past when he encountered unfamiliar languages, and although it wasn't perfect, it was usually a good starting point. He turned it on and looked at Carrie, holding it out. "Maybe this will help," he said with a smile, showing her the screen. She studied the device for a moment, her brow furrowing as she touched the screen with a tentative finger. At first, the translation was clumsy and strange. Words that made no sense appeared on the screen, and Carrie let out a small laugh at the confusion. She seemed amused, but also intrigued by the idea that communication could be so easily manipulated by a machine. Slowly, she began to speak into the translator, her voice soft but clear. "What is this?" she asked in a language that was unfamiliar to Elliot. The translator struggled to make sense of the words, but eventually, it spit out a rough translation. "I want to know what this is." Elliot's eyes widened in surprise. She had spoken in his language. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "It's a tool to help us understand each other," he explained, his voice gentle. "It won't always work perfectly, but it can help us talk." Carrie nodded slowly, clearly processing the idea. She was a quick learner, and it didn't take long before she began experimenting with the translator herself. She spoke softly into it, and this time, the translation was clearer. I am Carrie," she said. The translator picked up the words, displaying them on the screen for Elliot to read. "I am from the Audran people." Elliot smiled, relieved. "It's nice to meet you, Carrie," he said. "I'm Elliot." She looked at him with something resembling wonder in her eyes. For the first time, he felt as though they were truly communicating. He asked her about her home, about the Audran, and Carrie began to speak more freely, the translator helping to bridge the gap between them. "The Audran are travelers," she explained, her voice soft but full of pride. "We roam the stars, moving from one place to another. We trade, we learn, we live." Elliot listened intently, fascinated by her words. The Audran were unlike any species he had heard of before. They didn't seem to settle in one place, always moving, always searching. Carrie spoke of the stars with a sense of belonging, as though the vastness of space was something she had always known, something she was born to be a part of. But as she spoke, Elliot could sense a sadness in her words. The way she described the Audran's way of life seemed to hide something, a loss, a feeling of being disconnected from something greater. "Why did they leave you behind?" Elliot asked gently, his heart aching for her. Carrie looked away, her eyes distant. She didn't answer immediately, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the ship's engines. Elliot didn't press her. He knew that when she was ready, she would tell him. Finally, Carrie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They thought I was weak. I could not keep up. So they left me." Elliot's heart sank. He wanted to say something comforting, but words didn't seem enough. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a simple gesture of understanding. Carrie looked up at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow. She didn't speak, but in that moment, words weren't necessary. They shared a quiet understanding. From that point on, their bond grew stronger. As the days passed, Carrie learned more of Elliot's language, and Elliot began to understand more of hers. They spent hours talking, sometimes about their pasts, sometimes about their hopes for the future. It was clear that both of them had experienced loss, and in each other, they found something they hadn't known they were searching for: trust. After several days of learning to communicate, Elliot and Carrie had settled into a rhythm. They worked together, repairing parts of the venture and tending to the daily tasks of life aboard the ship. The small space they shared had become more than just a place to sleep. It was their home, a home that felt warmer and more alive with each passing day. Elliot had planned to take Carrie back to her people, to the last known location of the Audran fleet. The journey would be long and treacherous, but it was the right thing to do. Carrie's people had abandoned her, but she was still one of them, and Elliot knew that it was important for her to reconnect with her past. He had always been a wanderer, but this was different. He wasn't just taking her to any destination. He was taking her to a place where she could rebuild, find her purpose, and hopefully find peace. Carrie was still uncertain about going back. The idea of returning to her people, after everything that had happened, was overwhelming. But she trusted Elliot. She had come to depend on him, not just for survival, but for something more. There was an unspoken bond between them, a connection that neither could quite explain. She knew she couldn't go on alone, not anymore. As the days passed, the ship traveled deeper into uncharted space, moving toward the Audran fleet. The journey was not without its challenges. The space between star systems was vast, and they encountered pockets of dangerous radiation and cosmic storms that tested both their skills and their patience. But through it all, they worked together. Carrie had an uncanny sense of direction, and her knowledge of star charts proved invaluable. She navigated the ship through obstacles with a skill that surprised Elliot. Her sharp eyes and quick reflexes made her an excellent co-pilot, even though she had never piloted a ship before. Elliot was impressed by how quickly she adapted. Despite her past, despite the fear that had once held her back, Carrie was becoming a strong and capable presence aboard the venture. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found on the abandoned station. She was becoming a partner, an equal. In many ways, she was teaching him just as much as he was teaching her. One evening, as they watched the stars pass by the ship's viewports, Carrie sat beside Elliot in the cockpit. She had grown more comfortable with human food, but she still seemed fascinated by the way Elliot ate. He offered her a piece of dried fruit, and she took it with a smile, tasting it carefully before nodding in approval. "Do you miss your people?" Elliot asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Carrie looked out at the stars, her eyes reflecting the distant lights. "I don't know. I miss the stars, the feeling of being part of something bigger. But I also—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I feel lost, like I don't know where I belong anymore." Elliot understood that feeling. He had never really felt at home anywhere, always moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. But with Carrie, he felt something different. She wasn't just someone he was helping. She was someone he was growing with. For the first time in a long time, Elliot felt like he was part of something meaningful. "You belong here," Elliot said, his voice sincere. "You don't have to go back if you don't want to. I'm happy you're with me." Carrie's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you, Elliot. You've been so kind to me. I don't know what I would have done without you." Elliot smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "We're in this together. No matter what happens, we'll face it side by side." As the days passed, Carrie's confidence grew. She became more involved in the ship's operations, helping to maintain the engines and even taking on some of the more complex tasks. She was no longer just a passenger. She was a vital part of the journey. But Elliot noticed that she had moments when she would become distant, lost in her thoughts. He knew that part of her still struggled with the idea of returning to the Audrin. Despite everything, there was a part of her that missed the connection to her people, even if they had abandoned her. One afternoon, while Carrie was working on a maintenance issue in the engine room, Elliot went to check on her. He found her sitting quietly, staring at a small object in her hand. It was a pendant, an old, worn piece of jewelry that Carrie had kept since her time with the Audrin. "I used to wear this," Carrie said softly, noticing Elliot's presence. "It was a symbol of my family, my people. I thought I had lost it forever." Elliot knelt beside her, looking at the pendant. "It's beautiful. A reminder of where you come from, ah." Carrie nodded, her voice quiet. "I'm not sure I'll ever be able to go back, but I can't forget." Elliot placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a simple gesture of support. "You don't have to go back if you don't want to, Carrie. But whatever you decide, you're not alone. I'm here." Carrie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She knew, deep down, that her journey was far from over. But with Elliot by her side, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could find her way home, not to the Audrin, but to something more meaningful. Together, they would figure out where they truly belonged. As the days passed, Elliot and Carrie grew more accustomed to each other. Their communication was no longer limited to the translator. Carrie had learned much of the human language, and Elliot had picked up a few words of Audrin in return. The bond between them deepened, and each day felt like a new adventure, filled with discovery and shared experiences. One evening, as the ship glided through a quiet section of space, Elliot sat at the helm, his eyes scanning the star charts. Carrie was nearby, her sharp eyes trained on the viewports, watching the stars drift past in a mesmerizing dance of light. She had become an invaluable co-pilot, her knowledge of navigation and celestial bodies far surpassing Elliot's own. "Do you miss it?" Elliot asked quietly, breaking the silence. Carrie turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. "Miss what?" "Home," Elliot said, his voice soft. "Your people, your homeworld." For a moment, Carrie didn't answer. She stared out at the stars, as if searching for something in the distance. "I miss the stars," she said finally. "The feeling of being part of something bigger than myself. But I'm not sure I have a place among my people anymore. I feel different now, like I've changed." Elliot nodded, understanding her words. He, too, had often felt like an outsider, drifting from one place to another without ever really belonging anywhere. But with Carrie, he had found something that felt real, something that made him feel connected. It wasn't about a place. It was about the people you shared your journey with. "We're both different now," Elliot said, his voice thoughtful. "But that doesn't mean we don't belong. Maybe we just haven't found where we're meant to be yet." Carrie smiled softly, her gaze returning to the stars. There was a quiet strength in her now, something that hadn't been there when they first met. She had learned to rely on herself, to trust in her own abilities. The fear that had once clouded her eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet determination. As they approached the outer edge of known space, things started to get more complicated. The Audrin fleet was supposed to be nearby, but the area was known for its instability, shifting asteroid fields, unpredictable gravitational anomalies, and dangerous radiation pockets. The closer they got, the more challenging it became to navigate through the dense, uncharted space. Carrie, however, was unfazed. She had grown up navigating the unpredictable nature of space, and this was where she felt most at home. She studied the star maps and navigational readings with intense focus, offering suggestions and solutions to Elliot as they encountered each new obstacle. Elliot couldn't help but admire her confidence. It was as though she had tapped into something within herself, something that made her more than just a survivor. She was becoming a leader, guiding them through the unknown. One day, as they passed through a particularly volatile region of space, the ship's alarms blared. A sudden gravitational anomaly had thrown them off course, and they were being pulled toward a massive asteroid field. The sensors went wild, and the ship began to shake, its engines struggling to maintain control. "Hang on," Elliot shouted, grabbing the controls. Carrie was already at his side, her eyes locked on the readouts. "We need to adjust the power flow to the engines. If we can boost the thrusters just enough, we can break free." Elliot quickly followed her instructions, hands moving over the controls with practiced speed. The ship lurched as the engines roared back to life, fighting against the pull of the asteroid field. For a moment, it seemed as if they were losing the battle, but Carrie's steady guidance kept them on course. 5 seconds, she called out. "Hold steady." With a final burst of energy, they broke free, the ship shooting out of the danger zone just as a massive asteroid rocketed past them. The alarms stopped, and the ship's systems settled into a calm hum. Elliot exhaled, his hands still gripping the controls. That was close. Carrie let out a quiet laugh, her eyes shining with excitement. "That was nothing. We've got this." Elliot couldn't help but smile. He had seen many things in his travels, dangerous encounters, unexpected obstacles, but none of them had felt as real as this. Carrie wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a true partner, someone who had crossed boundaries, physical, emotional, and even cultural, with him. "Thank you," Elliot said, his voice sincere. "I don't think I could have done that without you." Carrie nodded, a small smile on her face. "We make a good team." As they continued their journey, Elliot realized that this trip, this adventure, wasn't just about getting Carrie back to her people. It was about discovering who they were meant to be together. Every challenge they faced brought them closer, not just as allies, but as something more. And though Carrie's past would always be a part of her, Elliot was beginning to understand that they were both creating something new, a future built on trust, partnership, and a shared journey through the stars. Days turned into weeks, and the journey through deep space became a quiet rhythm of exploration and discovery. Elliot and Carrie had settled into their roles. While Elliot remained the experienced pilot, Carrie had become a capable co-pilot, helping to navigate and fix the ship when it encountered problems. Despite the challenges, they grew closer with each passing day. One evening, after another successful repair to the ship's thrusters, Carrie sat next to Elliot in the cockpit, watching the stars. The beauty of the vast, open space had begun to feel less lonely, especially now that they had each other. "I've been thinking," Carrie said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but carried a weight of thoughtfulness. Elliot glanced over at her. "About what?" "The Audran fleet," she said, her gaze fixed on the stars. "We're getting closer, aren't we?" Elliot nodded, his fingers running over the ship's controls. The Audran fleet was just a few systems away, but Carrie's words carried more than just the reality of distance. There was an emotional weight to it. Carrie had told him about her people, how they had abandoned her, and how uncertain she felt about going back. "I don't know what I'll find when we get there," Carrie continued, her voice growing quiet. "I don't know if they'll accept me. After everything that happened, I feel like I'm a stranger to them." Elliot looked at her, his expression serious. "You've changed, Carrie. But that doesn't mean you've lost who you are. You've become stronger. And that strength is something they'll see when we get there." She turned to him, a small, uncertain smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Elliot replied firmly. "Whatever happens, I'll be with you." Carrie looked out at the stars again, her mind racing with thoughts of her past, her people, and what her future might look like. She had always felt a sense of duty to the Audran. But now, she was no longer the same girl who had been left behind. She had found new purpose in the journey, and in Elliot's quiet companionship, she had found someone who truly understood. "Thank you, Elliot," she said softly, "for everything." He smiled, the warmth of her words filling the cockpit. "You don't need to thank me. We're in this together." That night, as they rested in their small quarters, the stars outside seemed closer than ever. They were no longer just two travelers passing through space. They were something more. Together, they had built something that felt like a family. And in that moment, Carrie realized that even if the Odrin didn't welcome her back, she had a place where she truly belonged. The next morning, as they neared the final system before the Odrin fleet's last known position, Carrie sat at the ship's navigation station, her hands moving confidently over the controls. She had spent hours studying the star charts and preparing for their arrival, but the closer they got, the more uncertain she felt. The Odrin were a proud people, and her abandonment weighed heavily on her heart. "Are you ready?" Elliot asked from the cockpit, his voice calm. Carrie hesitated, her fingers hovering over the buttons. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew it was time. The moment had come. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "But I have to face them. I have to know what happened." Elliot nodded, his expression understanding. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Together." With one final deep breath, Carrie set the course toward the Odrin fleet's location. The ship hummed as it adjusted its trajectory, and soon, the familiar lights of the Odrin ships appeared on the scanners. They were just ahead. As the ship approached the fleet, Carrie's heart began to race. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, but she also felt a quiet sense of strength she had gained from the journey, from the bond she had formed with Elliot. The fleet was massive, a collection of ships that stretched across the stars. Each ship was different, each a reflection of the Odrin people's diversity and history. Carrie's hands trembled slightly as she watched the massive ships grow larger on the view screen. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to expect. Would they welcome her back, or would they reject her once again? "I'm scared," Carrie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't realized she was speaking aloud until Elliot's reassuring hand landed on her shoulder. "You don't have to face them alone," Elliot said gently. "I'm with you, every step of the way." Carrie turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. She wasn't alone, and that realization brought a sense of peace she hadn't expected. As they prepared to dock with the fleet, Carrie took one last look at the stars outside. For the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face her past and whatever the future held. No matter the outcome, she had found something far more important than a home. She had found a purpose, and in Elliot, a partner who would stand by her side no matter what. The venture slowed as it approached the Odrin fleet, the massive ships now visible on the ship's sensors. Carrie's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the controls, guiding the ship toward the docking bay. Her heart raced, and her thoughts were a whirl of uncertainty. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew this moment had come. Beside her, Elliot sat quietly, his presence a steady comfort. He had been her rock throughout this journey, and as much as Carrie wanted to face this alone, she knew she wasn't ready to do so without him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Elliot asked, his voice calm but full of care. Carrie took a deep breath and nodded. "I have to. I can't keep running from my past. I have to see them, face them." Elliot gave her a reassuring smile. "Then I'm right here with you. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together." She smiled back, her heart still heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, but she felt a bit lighter now with Elliot's support. Carrie glanced at the large Odrin ships, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. She had always been taught that the Odrin people were proud, disciplined, and loyal, but she wasn't sure if they would accept her after all that had transpired. The venture docked smoothly, and the airlock hissed as it sealed. Carrie and Elliot stood side by side, ready for whatever awaited them on the other side. The door to the ship's airlock opened slowly, revealing a dark hallway leading to a bustling docking station filled with Odrin crew members and their ships. Carrie's heart pounded as she stepped forward, her gaze searching for any familiar faces. She had no idea what to expect. Would they welcome her back as one of their own? Or would they see her as a traitor, someone who had failed them? As she and Elliot walked down the hall, an Audran officer approached them. He was tall, his face sharp with features that reminded Carrie of the Audran leaders she had known in her youth. His uniform was immaculate, and his posture proud. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Carrie, but his expression softened when he saw the human standing beside her. "You're back," the officer said, his voice deep and measured. "Carrie, you've been away for a long time." Carrie swallowed, her throat dry. I didn't mean to leave, but I had no choice." The officer's gaze softened further, though there was still a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "The Audran are not quick to forgive, but we recognize strength, and you've always been strong. Come with me." Carrie nodded, a wave of emotions washing over her as she followed the officer deeper into the heart of the fleet. The Audran ships were vast, filled with high-tech equipment and corridors that seemed to go on forever. The hustle of Audran crew members working on various tasks surrounded them, but there was a quiet tension in the air, as if everyone knew something significant was happening. Elliot followed closely behind her, his presence a silent reassurance. Though he was an outsider among the Audran, Carrie could feel his steady support. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew she wasn't facing it alone. They arrived at a large room, where a group of Audran leaders stood waiting. Among them was a figure Carrie recognized, a tall, older Audran who had once been a mentor to her. His name was Valdor, and he had been one of the ones who had helped shape her early training. "Valdor," Carrie said, her voice shaky, "I didn't think I'd see you again." Valdor regarded her for a moment before stepping forward. His expression was stern, but there was a softness in his eyes. "I thought you had abandoned us," he said quietly. "Your disappearance caused much unrest." Carrie lowered her gaze, feeling the weight of his words. "I didn't abandon anyone. I was forced to leave. My people. They chose to leave me behind." Valdor's face softened, and he nodded. "We were wrong to turn our backs on you, Carrie. I have seen the strength in you, and I should have known that you would return when the time was right." A wave of relief washed over Carrie, and for the first time since she had returned, she felt a sense of acceptance. The anger she had felt toward the Audran was still there, but it was starting to fade. In its place was a quiet understanding, a recognition that they, too, were just as lost as she had been. The room was silent for a moment as Carrie gathered her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to understand, and to see if there's a place for me, if you'll have me." Valdor looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You will always have a place among us, Carrie, but it will take time for everyone to see it." Carrie nodded, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, she felt like she had a future here, not just as an Audran, but as someone who had fought to make a place for herself. Elliot stood by her side, and she turned to him with a soft smile. He had given her the courage to come this far. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was no longer afraid of facing it. Together, they would find a way forward. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, discussions, and attempts to bridge the gap between Carrie and the Audran leaders. Though Carrie had initially feared rejection, she found that the Audran were more open to reconciliation than she had expected. The painful past was still there, lingering like a shadow, but there was a shared understanding that the future needed to be different. The Audran needed to change, just as she had. Carrie and Valdor spoke often, the mentor-mentee relationship they'd once shared slowly being rebuilt. There were moments of tension as old wounds were reopened, but there was also growth. Carrie shared her experiences in the human world, the lessons she had learned from her travels, and her time with Elliot. She spoke of how she had found new strength and purpose, and how the human had become more than just a companion. He had become her partner, her equal. Elliot, meanwhile, spent his time learning more about the Audran culture. He was fascinated by their technology, their history, and the way they viewed the universe. Although he was still an outsider among them, he found himself growing closer to the people who had once seemed so alien. He spent hours with Carrie, learning their language, listening to their stories, and slowly earning their trust. One evening, as Carrie and Elliot sat in a quiet corner of the ship's observation deck, looking out at the stars, Carrie turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" Elliot smiled, his eyes reflecting the stars outside. "Every day," he said softly. "But I think we're exactly where we need to be. We've both come so far, together." Carrie looked at him, a warmth filling her chest. It was strange how much had changed since their first meeting. Back then, she had been so lost, so unsure of everything. But now, as she sat beside Elliot, she realized that she wasn't just a survivor of her past. She was someone who had shaped her own future, and Elliot had been a part of that, every step of the way. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," Carrie said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Someone who understands me, who believes in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Elliot took her hand, his smile gentle. "I always believed in you, Carrie. You just needed to see it for yourself." Carrie squeezed his hand, grateful for the support he had given her, and for the future they were building together. Despite the challenges ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. As the days passed, the Odrin began to accept her once again. There were still those who were skeptical, those who believed that she had abandoned them, but Valdor and others stood by her, helping to change their minds. Slowly, Carrie earned the respect of her people, and though she had no idea what her exact role would be in the Audran future, she knew that it was a future worth fighting for. One day, as Carrie and Elliot walked through the halls of the Audran ship, she turned to him, a smile on her face. "I've been thinking," she said. Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Oh, that sounds serious." Carrie chuckled, shaking her head. "It's not as serious as it sounds, but I've been wondering, what if we built something together? Not just between us, but with the Audran and the humans." Elliot looked at her, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. "You mean, like a new alliance?" Carrie nodded. "Yes, maybe it's time for both our people to find common ground. There's so much we can learn from each other, and together, we could create something bigger than just two species, something that could change the galaxy." Elliot considered her words, his mind racing. He had always known that there was more to this journey than just finding a way for Carrie to return to her people. It was about creating something new, something hopeful. "I like that idea," he said finally. "A future where we all work together. I think that's worth fighting for." Carrie's smile widened. "I think so too. And maybe we'll have our own little piece of that future." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He looked at her, seeing the hope in her eyes. For the first time, it wasn't just about the challenges of the past. It was about building a future, side by side. "Together?" he asked softly. "Together," she confirmed, her voice full of conviction. And with that, they both looked out at the stars once more. The vastness of space was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. The future was uncertain, but they knew one thing. It was theirs to shape. Together, they would create a future where both humans and Audran could thrive, side by side. And no matter what obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together.